It's a great life when you love the Lord, amen? It's wonderful to be with you here again this morning as always, and always appreciate all of you being here with us. It may be a few weeks removed, but if you remember the lesson I gave a couple weeks ago about true righteousness being taught, and we covered some of the contrasts that were spoken of in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through about 32, and we'll go over some of that. We're going to continue on with that lesson series. We're going to continue on talking about that, even though we took a little break for Easter and that kind of thing. But I hope you'll follow along with me. We're going to be focusing on this idea of righteousness, what it really is, what it really means, what Jesus is trying to teach us with this passage, or with this set of contrasts that he has throughout Romans chapter 5. And the key thought is in Romans chapter 5, verse 20, the main thing this whole lesson comes from. It says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." That is a scary thing to think about for people of that day and age. Because think about who the scribes and Pharisees are to them. They are their religious leaders. This would be like someone saying to you potentially, if your righteousness doesn't surpass that of the preacher and the elders, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's the mentality that the people are having to deal with. But what Jesus goes on to say is he's trying to show them that the people who were leading them, these Pharisees, these scribes, were not living up to the standard that they were asked to live by God. They were creating their own standards rather than following God. And that's why he's saying that we have to do better than that. We have to live by God. We have to live by what he asks us to do. Because if we don't, you see it right there. He says, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's something you have to be aware of. Something we all need to be aware of in our lives. We're not the ones who get to make that happen. God chooses who gets to be in his kingdom. It's those who believe in him, those who love him, those who live their lives for him. And this is part of that aspect, is living your life in a righteous way. So, just by way of reminder, this is what we talked about a couple weeks ago. We talked about the scribes and Pharisees' righteousness versus the true righteousness, which is that of what Jesus is teaching. You had the scribes and Pharisees in the first contrast. They said, do not commit murder. But Jesus said, don't even be angry. Because what the Pharisees were getting at is they said, yeah, as long as you don't actually physically touch the person or hurt the person, you can hate them as much as you want. And Jesus says, that's not right. You don't hate the other person. That's not what you're supposed to be. That's not the heart of someone who is a follower of God. In the second contrast, we talked about adultery. And they said, you could think about that person all you wanted to. You could lust after them all you wanted to. Just as long as you don't actually do anything about what you want to do. It's okay if it's all in your head. And Jesus turned around and says, no, it's not. That doesn't show a heart that's after God. That doesn't show somebody who's focusing their minds on him, meditating on him with all they are. If you're going to be that kind of person, you're already sinning in your life. And then the third one we talked about was the contrast of divorce. They said, you can divorce as much as you need to, as long as you give them a certificate so that they'll be okay by our law. And Jesus says, no, that's not right. Divorce is only to be used in the case of unchastity. If any other case comes about, then it is wrong. And you are bringing sin about on both of your life and the life of the person you're divorcing, as well as anybody else who gets involved in that situation. I want you to see that this is not just they do this, Jesus says to do this, but this is more a depth of heart problem with these people. The Pharisees knew the law. They knew what it was, but they didn't want to follow it in the way that God asked them to. They wanted to be able to have their own rules or do their own things or make it work to their benefit, whatever it might be. And so what you actually see throughout this is that the reason why this righteousness is an issue, why the people's righteousness needs to be better than theirs, was because theirs was null and void. They really didn't have any true righteousness in them because they weren't trying to live the way God asked them to. Not really. Their heart was not in the place that it needed to be. So let's continue on going through these last three contrasts this morning. The first one is the contrast of vows in verses 33 to 37. And notice the two phrases again with all these contrasts, why you can pull them out pretty easy, is the "you have heard it once said," or "you have heard it said by the ancients," and then it says, "but I say to you." So in verse 33 it says, "Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, or for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil, or is of the evil one." You could literally translate it there. So we're talking about vows in this section. The contrast. Again, we're going to be looking at the issues that these Pharisees were teaching and telling people how to be, and why it was causing problems, and why it was going about in the wrong way and making people into something they shouldn't have been. And what you see with the Pharisees is they were people who, like modern day lawyers you could maybe say today, they wanted to read the fine print. Say, what does it really say that I have to do? Where's the loophole to get out of it? And that's the mentality that the Pharisees had. That's something we have to understand, because it is true that the rabbis taught that you have to fulfill your vows. But what the Pharisees did is they would come in and they would say, you only have to fulfill your vows if the Lord's name was a part of it. And so if you vowed something on the name of the Lord, you had to complete that vow. And so what you would see them do is they would take everything else and say, we would vow it upon this or vow it upon that, and then we don't have to keep it because we didn't use the Lord's name. It's okay since we didn't use the Lord's name. Well, what you would end up seeing is that they would swear oaths by things like heaven. They would swear oaths by earth. They would swear oath by Jerusalem. They would swear oaths by the altar. They would swear it by the gold of the temple itself, the utensils that are used on the altar. All these things that have no meaning, really, and have no place or as to why they're making an oath. But the fact that they were something special in the sense of the minds of the people, something that God was expecting the priests to use in their sacrifices, they would use those things to swear these oaths. But then because they didn't use God's name, they didn't really keep them. And so what you see that the Pharisees would do and the leaders would do at this time is they would make these oaths, they would make these promises, they would make these swears, and they would swear them on these kind of things. But it's basically like you being the kid you maybe were when you were young and you have your fingers crossed behind your back, not ever really intending to keep that vow. And so you had people that could say whatever they wanted to say and never actually intend to do what they say. That is what's going on here. That is what we have to understand we're dealing with when it comes to these Pharisees, the scribes, whoever they're talking about specifically, that they're dealing with this kind of stuff. Which is why we understand that the law itself does not actually condemn vows or oaths. There's a lot of people who take this passage and say, you shouldn't make vows. You should never make vows on anything or any kind of oaths. Well, it's not exactly that cut clean and clear as far as what is actually expected. Because we know for a fact that there are times where oaths are made in the Bible, and that was actually what was expected. There's times where it is required to make certain oaths. I got a couple examples up there, one in Exodus chapter 22. If you go and read that passage, it's an oath that's made between two men and their livestock because one is overseeing the other, maybe while he is away. And they make an oath that, if something happens by accident, I'm not going to come against you. But if something happens under your watch, it's going to be on your head or on your fault. You're going to have to repay for what I lost if you don't properly take care of them. It's that kind of oath. And then in Numbers chapter 5, there's an oath that was made between women and God, or women and the priests, when they were accused of unchastity or accused of doing something that was unclean like that. And they would have to make this oath. They would be required to make this oath as well as do things along with it that would go to prove that they were clean and they were pure. And so it was an oath to prove their purity. So there are definitely times, and you can find more than just these, but there are times throughout the Bible where oaths are actually required or even taken. You can even see times in the New Testament, I believe, where Jesus himself and Paul both take an oath. Maybe not necessarily the kind of oath as they were in the Old Testament, but oaths were taken. We also can see that oaths were supposed to be taken in a particular way. And this goes right in the face of what the Pharisees or the religious leaders were teaching. Is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, when you take an oath, you better take it in the name of God, because we don't want you to use the excuse that the Pharisees did later down the road. Don't take it on any other pagan gods or anything else. It's taken on God, because you're going to carry that oath out. If you're going to make that oath, if you're going to make that vow, you carry it out. And it'll be by God's name that you make it. And then we also see that there were pronounced consequences upon those who took oaths, especially those who were making false vows. This was the idea that similar to what the Pharisees were doing, is they were making false vows from the very beginning. They had never intended to keep their oath, no matter what it was, and you would have to live with the consequences. You can look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. It talks about those who make false vows will not go unpunished. There will be punishment that will be had. In Deuteronomy 19, it talks about that their own intentions will be brought upon them. That's in the case of situations where somebody makes an oath, or the idea, again, bringing in lawyers and that kind of thing, is let's say someone gets up on a stand and makes a false testimony because they wish for wrongdoing to happen to the other person. They are wishing for something bad to happen to them. And in Numbers chapter 19, it says your own intentions are going to rebound upon you. You're going to get what you're dealing out. It's going to come back on you. And then again, a few chapters later, in Numbers chapter 23, it says that when you do this, when you make these false vows, that is sin to you. So the whole point is not necessarily that the vows or the oaths are condemned or wrong in and of themselves. But it's the point that we're not supposed to be making these false vows. If we are going to make a vow, if you're going to oath to something, you need to keep it. That is the real point that Jesus is trying to get at. Now, we don't necessarily need to make oaths today. We shouldn't necessarily have to make oaths today. That's part of what Jesus is getting at too. He says you need to just be people of your word. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do what you're going to say you do, and don't do what you say you won't. Don't go either or. And so what you see is that Jesus denounces this hypocrisy and this deceit by the Pharisees that he's dealing with. And he really gets to this point that he says that your oaths are really pointless because they're made with no intention to keep it. You at no point at any time do you actually believe in what you're saying. You're just saying whatever you need to say to get to what you need to get to. You have no intention of doing what is right. And so he actually affirms that all oaths are binding. So he's not necessarily saying that it's simply condemned, but he's saying it doesn't matter what you say or what you make an oath by. If you make an oath by anything, it is binding to you. And that's what he gets at when he says, because I brought up a little bit about what they would make oaths on, and he actually says it in the verses. He says, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven. We mentioned heaven. And he says, why? For it is the throne of God. If you're going to make an oath by heaven, you're still talking about God, even though you didn't use his name. So you're going to keep that oath. He says, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet. Again, referencing to him. Or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. All these things that they're making oaths on and then ignoring, all have an aspect of God built within them. And they are supposed to keep all these oaths, and they're supposed to be binding with all these. That's how important this is. He's trying to get it to the point that do what you're saying you're going to do. Don't go about your life with the intention to just do whatever you want to do and just try to get away with lying and things like that. And most importantly, he says his desire for us, and this is what he's saying at the end, is for us to speak and answer plainly with truth as his disciples. That's what he wants us to do. He doesn't want us to have to worry about trying to make an oath that says, I promise I'm telling you the truth. He says, let your truth be easily seen by just being plain and simple with people. Tell them what you are needing to tell them, and then show that what you're saying is true by doing what you said you would do. Don't worry about making an oath. Don't worry about making a vow. Just simply be who you say you're going to be. And that is a follower of Christ, a follower of God. Act that way. That is what he's getting at here. And so what the point of all it is, as I said before, be people of your word. Don't worry about the vows. Don't worry about the oaths. Just do what you're going to say you do, and don't do what you won't. Act the way that you say you will. Do what you're supposed to. That's what Jesus is expecting of us. That's what he's wanting of us in this section. That's the contrast he's trying to make between what he wants of his followers, those who are going to have righteousness that surpasses the religious leader, and the religious leaders of the day themselves. The next contrast is that of revenge in Matthew 38 through 42 of chapter 5. Let's read that. It says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." All right, so we're talking about a lot of illustrations here that he's using to teach on this contrast. And there's a lot to get into. But the first thing we want to talk about is he starts off with what they have heard. They heard the phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So what does that phrase mean? What is it really getting at? You know, there's a term that's used that many of you may have heard or know. It's called lex talionis. It's the law of retaliation. That is the idea here. And the problem is they would take this law and they would upend what it really was all about. Because on its head, a lot of times it may appear that this is a savage and cruel law. But actually what it is merciful. And the reason is because this law was meant to do a few things. It was meant to prevent a person from exacting a greater revenge than what they had been done to them. You know, let's say an eye for an eye. We'll use that exact example. It says an eye for an eye. Not someone takes your eye, so you take both of theirs. Or someone took your eye, so you take their life. Now, we do understand that there is a punishment involved, but the point of the law is not to be cruel. It's not to overdo the punishment, but the idea is that it's merciful in the sense that it's supposed to be a punishment fitting the crime. You don't have a right to do any more than they did to you just because you were wronged. That's not the kind of person that we get to be. The other aspect of this is it was to help prevent, and you know, we might see it today in our society sometimes, this was the idea to help prevent roaming bands of people to go out and exact revenge when something was done that was wrong. I mean, I can probably guess that for many of you, and I don't have a daughter, but for many of you that have a daughter, if somebody did something to your little girl that you did not like, or maybe did something that was wrong, you would probably go and do something to that person that maybe God wouldn't want you to do, but you would definitely feel the need to, and you might even get people to go and help you with that. I'm not saying you did that, but that is what rises up in your mind. That is what rises up in your heart because of what someone did, the evil that they did. But this law was supposed to help prevent things like that, prevent those kind of situations from happening. It just, in our own minds, no matter who you are, no matter how godly you are trying to be, it doesn't affect the fact that when somebody wrongs you, you feel the need to get even or to even get back at a higher degree. And so this law was supposed to help maintain mercy and to maintain order to a degree. And that's why the third part of this is the fact that it is supposed to fit the crime. It's not supposed to be something that is a greater punishment than what they did to you or what they did to somebody else. It's supposed to fit the actual crime that they committed. That's why it is a law of mercy. And the other part of this is that similar to today, or how today is supposed to work, is that its retribution was restricted to judicial administration. It's exactly how it was supposed to do. It was supposed to have proper legal protections. That way, we just talked about making false vows, and some of that being people making false testimony. All throughout the Old Testament, as well as even in the New, you'll see that it says by 2 or 3 witnesses. You can't just go up and have one person say that you did something wrong, and then all of a sudden you are definitely charged guilty with that verdict. There has to be the right amount of evidence that can corroborate what happened so that people aren't just punished for no reason. Again, all of this law is more about mercy than just simply about the idea of retaliation, as many people like to make it out to be. This is so people are taken care of in the way that they should be. Now, what you are going to see is that even though this law is many times taken a little out of what it should be, Jesus is going to use some illustrations here to institute basic principles about retaliation from a personal standpoint. And so the first one that he uses is the turn the other cheek in verse 39. And what he's saying here is that we are supposed to be the kind of people who remain humble, who remain meek in spirit. We aren't the kind of people who try to retaliate. If somebody's going to slap you, don't stress over that. It's not worth it in this life. And what that can do is it shows an innocence on our part. Whether we were right or wrong in the situation, whether we deserved it or not, it shows a generous attitude as well as dignity and character, that you are going to be the kind of person that just because somebody slaps you or somebody wrongs you, you are not going to turn around and wrong them back. That is the idea that he's talking about here. That is what he's getting at, is that our heart needs to be one where we're focusing on what's really important, what's ahead, and not what's happening right here in front of us, not worried about the little things that somebody might do. And I know sometimes in our society, and you might say that if you've ever taken a punch to the face, you'd rather take a punch to the face than a slap, because a slap is in many cases more humiliating, and that's the way it's been seen throughout all of history. It shows that somebody is either challenging you or something like that. But even in that kind of situation, Jesus is using an illustration that you are to be someone who turns the other cheek. Don't retaliate for something like that. Move on with your life. Move forward with your life. Focus on what you should be focusing on. And then in verse 40, he goes into the second one. He says, let him have your coat also. Now, this is one of those things where he's actually talking about, we brought up lawyers and things, he's talking about a real-life lawsuit kind of situation. When somebody's coming up against you and trying to sue you, let's say somebody back then did something wrong, and maybe you took or stole or did something to some of their livestock, or maybe lost some of their possessions, whatever it may have been, you had the right to go and sue them for their tunic, so that you could be reimbursed, so to speak, for what was done. Or at least if they didn't have money, they could pay you by giving you their clothes. That is how it worked back then. It doesn't necessarily work that way now. If it did, then people would pay off lawsuits very differently probably. But you could give it. And the coat was the more important part of your ensemble back then, because it would be the outer layer, the layer that protects you from the elements. It would be the layer that you would use on hot days to roll up and use as a pillow under your head when you're laying out in the grass or out on the land or something like that. The coat had a lot of aspects to it over the tunic, which was just your undergarments. And so he says, if somebody's going to sue you for it, just give them your coat also. And the idea is that it's better to just give up the coat than to be bitter and resentful and drag out this lawsuit that is going to end up causing a dissension or dissatisfaction or whatever you want to call it between both parties. It's just going to create a bigger mess. There's no point in that. Paul even reiterates this later on in 1 Corinthians when he wrote that it would be better for a Christian to be defrauded than to take a matter to court before unbelievers. I know that might be an odd thing to say or an odd thing to even believe in, but this is what Paul is saying. He's saying it's not worth it to be dragged out and made you look like a horrible person before the whole world. Just simply be a good Christian and just let go of whatever is trying to be taken from you, because in the end, that, whatever it is, doesn't matter. That's not what's important. What's important is that you walk with God. And everything else, God will take care of. He will have your back. And so Jesus is saying, don't get into these situations where you're going to cause issues as to what a Christian looks like or what the image that you're putting off as a follower of Christ is, but to simply just let them have your coat, just move on with your life from that kind of situation. In verse 41, he uses this go 2 miles illustration. This is one I know a lot of people like to use and a lot of people like to talk about. I've heard a lot of devotionals on this passage where he says, if anybody asks for you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. There's a lot of good aspects of this. One of the things that's great about this is Jesus is trying to teach us that this is a moment where we can be doing an act of kindness even in the midst of oppression. Now, it might sound weird that I use the word oppression there, but remember, we're talking about all this stuff is retaliation involved to a degree. All this stuff has to do with that idea of revenge. Don't be upset that somebody has to ask you to go with them. The way it worked back in history is that the soldiers had the right to go to a Jew, to go to one of the people of Israel and say, hey, I need you to carry my stuff. And the law said that they had to do that for 1 mile. And the thing is they were so to the point that they would go and mark out 1 mile in the sand beforehand, and they would know exactly where they had to stop so that they could drop the stuff and go home. And Jesus is saying, don't be that way. If you truly want to be a Christian who is righteous in heart all the way through, then you're going to be someone who is going to do an act of kindness even in the midst of oppression. Even when you're being forced to do something you don't want to do, you're going to do even more than what's asked of you, because that's what it means to be a Christian. You're going to show what it truly is. And in the end, that is the higher level of righteousness that he's talking about, because that is a moment where you get to go to someone and you can have a godly influence on their life. Because even if you're being oppressed, even if you're being forced to do something that nobody has the right to make you do, and you still act like a Christian, it's hard to ignore that example. It's hard to ignore that at all. Now the last part, the last illustration he uses, and to some degree it has to deal with revenge, but it does change tone a little bit, is in verse 42 where he talks about the idea of giving and loaning. Now that first part, when he comes to talking about giving, one of the things that you have to understand, this was not necessarily about mistreatment or oppression, but he's talking about the needs of others before your own, because you would have people that would come to you that are truly in need. Let's talk about the people who were lame, the people who were blind, the people who were homeless back then. They were supposed to be taken care of. And they even had laws that said you are supposed to take care of them, that you are supposed to help them, and to openly give them of what you have in abundance. And so that's what that giving aspect of this part is. He says he wants you to think about other people and their needs before your own convenience is really what it's talking about. It might not always be easy for you to give up of what you have, but you are supposed to help those who are in need. And then the loan side of this, the second part of the verse, he's not talking about loaning somebody money as a business investment. He's not talking about loaning somebody money in that kind of respect. We're talking about, let's say, a fellow brother or sister, or maybe somebody out in the world who is not poor, who is not necessarily destitute like it is with the idea of giving. But we're talking about someone who is doing their very best, is doing what they can, but they're strapped and they're in a financial crisis and they need a little bit of help. And so he's telling them, help those people, but do it in a way where you don't expect anything in return. In the idea, they're almost both like giving, because he says, let them borrow from you. If they come seeking your help and they really are needing it, then you give it to them, and don't expect anything in return. That's what he expects of us. He expects us to be better by not asking for interest, by not asking for anything back. And he says, blessed are you if they do give back. But don't expect it. Help them out of the goodness of your heart. That's what it means to be a Christian. Help them as a brother and sister. Help them as a fellow person in the community, as a fellow human being. Whatever the reasoning you want to put behind it, you help them because they need help. That's what it means to be a righteous person, to live in the way that God wants us to live. So what's the point of all this as far as this revenge discussion goes? Be people of mercy and kindness. Don't seek revenge. Don't seek retaliation, no matter what the situation comes. But be people who think of others first, rather than self. Sometimes that's hard to do. But that's what God and Christ are asking us to do here. The last contrast we're going to look at is the contrast of love. In verses 43 and 48, it says, "You have heard it that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." So this last one we're talking about is love. So what's being taught? Well, on one hand, the people were rightly being taught to love thy neighbor. And that's where it comes from. It comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. It is something that has been taught all throughout the Bible. It's even one of the great commands, the second greatest command, as they say, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus reinstitutes later in the New Testament. Only after loving God does it come as far as a command. That's how important this is. So it's definitely something important that they need to be taught, and they have been taught ever since just about the beginning. The problem is that how they define their neighbor. And you'll see in other instances where Jesus kind of illustrates that with the person who's injured on the side of the road. If you remember that parable, who actually comes and helps him? Who acted like that person's neighbor? That's what Jesus is getting at here as well. The problem was they were people who narrowly defined what a neighbor was. And it was these kind of people. It was the people that were close to them. It was the people that were within their inner circle, so to speak. Their friends, their family, or maybe even acquaintances is about as far spread as it would get. And so their neighbors would be only the people of their choosing. You kind of see how that works as a problem? They're only allowing neighbors to be the ones that they want. But then on the other hand, so not only are they already wrongly understanding love your thy neighbor, but on the other hand, they're wrongly being taught this idea to hate your enemy. Now, Jesus does use this quote here, but what you're going to find, or at least I couldn't find, is that there is no Old Testament quote that actually backs that part of the phrase. This is the part that they added. This is the part that the leaders of the people added to the Word of God. And I'll tell you, anytime that you see someone adding to God's teachings, it's usually not a good sign. It's usually not the way that you're supposed to go. And one of the reasons that we know this, or one of the reasons we can understand this, is no matter where you go in the Bible, at no point do you ever see God saying that he hates or he wants us to hate these people. Any people that you're talking about. You know, it's true that God uses people to punish other nations. He used Israel people to punish certain nations that were not living by him. And he even used other nations to punish Israel when they turned away from God. But at no point in time, whether they were being destroyed or not, did God ever say, you need to hate the people you're destroying. You'll never find that. And so that's one of the things they're wrongly taught here. One of the things that Jesus is trying to correct is that you are not supposed to hate your enemy. You're not supposed to hate at all, but the love your neighbor is supposed to be encompassing of all of that. And so Jesus calls upon us to be righteous as his Father was, or to be like his Father. He starts out by saying, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you and show kindness to all men. That is the idea of what we are supposed to be doing. That is how we are supposed to act as people. And then he gets on towards the end of the verse. He says, be perfect. Now I want you to notice that in the context, this is perfect love. We understand Romans chapter 3, verse 23, as well as other places in the Bible, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is not a call to be perfect in the general sense of being perfect. And we have to understand that, because a lot of people will take this out of context and be disheartened by this statement, because they know that they can't live up to that request. But one of the things you're going to find is that Jesus did not give this command intending that his disciples would be defeated by it or would feel down about it because it was impossible. But instead, it was meant to inspire to do better. It was meant to inspire to try to be more like God, to follow him each and every day, to be that kind of person. That is the example we're supposed to live up to. That is what he's trying to get at. He's trying to inspire us. So what's all this in the end mean? Jesus is trying to tell us to live as people who love completely. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. I don't care if you like them or not. You love completely. You are to be someone who loves every person in an even and fair way, because they are all created equal as people of God, whether they follow God or not. They all deserve your love. And so that is what Jesus is getting at. He doesn't want us to be like the Pharisees, the scribes, or the leaders in any way, in the sense that we are people who choose only who we want to love. That's why he says, hey, the tax collectors do that. The Gentiles do that. We're supposed to be better. We're supposed to have the kind of righteousness that God does. We're supposed to be like him. So what's all this mean for us? Well, the first thing I want to make us understand is that truth is at a premium today. You know, white lies, whether big or small, whatever you want to say, the world is not the way it used to be. And maybe it was never the way it was supposed to be. But today, for sure, truth is at a premium. And what Jesus is trying to teach us here, that it is better for us to just be people of our word than to try to give credence to our word by swearing on things if we don't have an intention to actually keep it. That is what we need to be doing. The other part of that, and if you look at the book of James, James chapter 2, verses 12, it says, so speak and so act as those who are going to be judged by the law of liberty. You know, one of the things that it doesn't say in that is it doesn't phrase it as, I promise to speak and act, in a way. It says, so speak and so act as those who are going to be judged. Don't worry about making the vows, whether they're wrong or right to make. Just simply be people of your word. That is what it means to live the kind of righteous life that is surpassing that of even the scribes and Pharisees. The second part of that is that we all probably understand that we live in an age of self. You know, when you're talking about revenge and all those kind of things, it's hard not to think about self in that situation. You know, everything in this life tends to be about us, and it's getting egged on more and more as the years go by. You know, we're a culture, we're a people who are encouraged to be self-centered, to be self-involved, to be self-indulgent, and whatever other self word you want to put in there. Constantly, this idea that we are thinking about self. But one of the things I hope that you will realize or understand today is that when life and we as people become all about self, true righteousness is gone. True righteousness is lost. Because it's not about ourselves. It's about God, and it's about caring for others. Those are the two commandments, are they not? Nowhere in there does it say about ourselves. So that's what we need to be. And then finally, just a reminder when it comes to that love. Jesus commanded us to love. It's important, but it's not impossible. He commanded us to love in a perfect way as God does, in the sense that we love everybody equally. We love everybody whether we actually like them or not. You can see all throughout the Bible that there's times that God did not like what people were doing, But does that mean that he did not send his son to the cross so that they could have a chance to be redeemed? Does that mean he didn't love them still, even though he may not agreed with the way they lived their life? We don't have to agree with the way that somebody lives their life just to show them love. That's what agape love really is. It means that you are looking out for their best interests, regardless of if you agree with the way they live, regardless if you agree with the way they believe. You care about them enough to show that you love them, not to treat them differently in any way. That is what it means to be someone who is going to be like Christ in the perfect love that Christ exudes for all. I hope these lessons will stick with you not only this morning but for the rest of your life. I hope there's something that will be meaningful for you each and every day from here on forward. I hope that this morning, if you're here and maybe you've been living contrast to what some of these teachings have been, that you will change that in your life, that you will look to Christ as someone who will guide you, who will be an example for you, who will help you find the way to be the righteous person that he asks you to be. If you're here this morning and maybe you have never had Christ as part of your life, you have never started that walk of righteousness with God, I'm sorry to tell you this, but if you have not started that walk, then you won't enter the kingdom either. So you have to be part of the family of God. You have to be walking in him to join the kingdom. Don't let that be the problem for you. Don't wait. Become a part of the kingdom. Trust in God. He's there for you. He doesn't ask of that much, but he does ask that you love him and that you love others above all. If you're ready to do that, I hope you will this morning. If there's anything we can do for you, I hope that you'll come as we stand and we sing.